we're going to get into the sort of practical political construction of the Canadian sort of state a little later on. There's some other sort of bigger questions around the Constitution and around the Senate and that kind of thing. But for right now, we're going to talk a little bit about what brings us to the sort of Confederation Agreement, the Charlottetown Accord, that creates the country of Canada, sort of the sort of political environment of Canada in 1867. So no one sets out to create their own country for no good reason. That kind of movement is really driven by a number of tensions in Canada. And we just talked about one of them in our most recent video, and one of those is a concern about US expansionism. There was a concern that the population and sort of government of the United States was really interested in expanding their territory, and that Canada was probably going to be the next step after they finished dealing with the indigenous populations sort of in the Northwest. And that is sort of driven by Canada's experience with the War of 1812, the settlement of Alaska, and also the very real experience for Canada. Those of you who've never really thought about it, in this period of time, no one has good treatment for PTSD. And that's important partially because since 1775, okay, you have a relatively large population of the U.S. Of U.S. citizens who have gone through war. Okay, so first you have the Revolutionary War starting in the 1770s. Then you have sort of similar armed conflicts in the U.S. Civil War that come not too far after that. And one of the things that that means is you have a large population of people in the United States who, for their own sort of, like, for a really important part of their adult lives, have essentially earned their livings making war. They've gone through a bunch of trauma at that point in time because, you know, war in that period of time is really bloody and you're going to watch people die in horrible, terrible ways. And combat is pretty close quarters, so you're going to have your own memories of, for example, watching, like, having stabbed someone and having them bleed out on you. Like, you're going to have some difficult mental health experiences there. And those mental health experiences make it really difficult for you to reintegrate back into normal society. We know that that is the case now, and we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to figure out how to treat PTSD, and that diagnosis doesn't exist till the 1940s. So in the 1840s, we don't really have a way of dealing with this, which means you have a large portion of the US population that is really good at pursuing goals through violence and really hard to integrate back into the community. And you also have a large portion of that population that has been at war so long that the economic sort of situation in the communities where these people come from, so the farming communities, the manufacturing communities, has sort of adapted to them not being there. And we could talk about this in terms of the First and Second World War as well, but if you take a large portion of people who are used to sort of pursuing things through violence and don't integrate into the rest of society very well, and you try to cram them into a system that is adjusted to their not being there, one of the things that you wind up with is relatively high rates of unemployment, and the people who tend to be unemployed tend to be psychologically unstable. That's not a really great recipe for economic growth, so there's an inclination, especially in this period of time, to essentially say, well, the solution is to keep people in the army fighting. If you don't send them home, you don't have to reintegrate them and you don't have to treat their PTSD because they're perfectly well adapted to continuing to fight wars. So that sort of concern about US expansionism and a concern that in order to keep those people engaged in military activities, the US would turn its attention north is part of the tension that sort of provokes the Confederation, the sort of development of Confederation. One of the other concerns that sort of comes out of that is the fact that the western part of what is now Canada and was Prince Rupert's Land, we'll talk about that a little later on, is really sparsely populated. There aren't a lot of people living in it. And that's important because we sort of talked about why you need population growth. With a really small population, maintaining order is really, really difficult. And that's really difficult because you can't have more police officers than you have people. And that means that you have to have essentially mobile police officers that are patrolling really large portions of the country. And that means that they might only come through any given community for 2 weeks of the year. And that means that for 50 weeks of the year, you really don't have a whole lot of control about what's going on there. So there's that kind of piece. And another challenge of that sort of sparsely populated West is tensions between an agricultural way of life that the British Crown was really trying to encourage and Métis and Indigenous ways of life that are quite different and require different patterns of land use and different patterns of sort of hunting and harvesting and different regulations. And there's tensions between those two groups in the West that are also a challenge. And sort of harmonizing into one country kind of makes that a little bit easier. And then there's the sort of first set of tensions that we talked about last week, which is this idea about tensions between an Anglophone and a Francophone population, right? The British Crown kind of started their colonization of North America with an expectation that it was only a matter of time before Francophones assimilated and became essentially like the Anglophones, right? That expectation that a minority group is essentially going to become exactly like the colonizing power 100% comes back next week when we talk about Indigenous experiences of Canada, but for right now we're going to talk about it in terms of the Anglophone and Francophone kind of conversation. And as we're moving into the 1860s, Durham's report, right? Like Lord Durham's report came out in 1840. We have some evidence and some explanations of what we should be doing in this context in order to solve this problem. But if you remember talking about that, we're not really applying Durham's solutions, right? Like Durham said, you should have one house, like one elected representative body that mixes Anglophones and Francophones. And what the British Crown did was say, oh, that's a really good idea. We're going to create two houses and make an equal Anglophone and Francophone ones, and they can cooperate. And that sort of situation doesn't really lead to meaningful assimilation because the Francophones and the Anglophones now have their own political representation and don't always talk to each other. And there's sort of some entrenchment of that kind of tension. So the solution to this is some negotiation of a confederation to sort of bring together what are, at this point in time, disparate Canadian colonies. So one of the things you need to understand is that in the 1850s, the 1860s, Canada is not one colony, it's a whole bunch of different ones. So what is now Ontario has its own governor. What is now Quebec has its own governor general. What is now New Brunswick has its own governor general. What is now Nova Scotia has its own governor general. What is now Prince Edward Island actually has its own governor general. So all of these are functioning as separate colonies with the entire Canadian West being administered as Prince Rupert's land. We'll get to that in a bit too, as we sort of talk about this a little later on in our class. But sort of we have these like very disparate political entities. So the Charlottetown Conference in 1864 negotiates some collaboration to sort of create a single political identity to represent all of those sort of existing colonies and political positions. Okay, so we'll talk some very, very brief stuff. This is in 1867, the original sort of members, I guess, of the Canadian state is exclusively Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Okay, you only have those four provinces. Other provinces are created and join a little bit later. So Manitoba is created in 1870. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about Métis history. British Columbia joins in 1871. Prince Edward Island joins the Canadian Confederation in 1873. Alberta and Saskatchewan are carved out of Prince Rupert's land along with some expansions of Manitoba in 1905. And as I said, Newfoundland doesn't join the Canadian Confederation until 1949. We'll get into some more of those details when we talk sort of more in depth about that. For right now, I want you to understand that there is that process of different organizations joining at different times. And the other thing that's really, really important to understand is that for the most part, if you didn't live in Upper Canada, okay, if you didn't live in what is now Ontario, they essentially had to bribe you to join this sort of confederation. So the goals of this were essentially to sort of do that kind of piece, to resolve tensions between the Anglophones and the Francophones, by which I mean, in the view of sort of Upper Canada and Canada West, the goal there was to essentially create a political entity that had so many Anglophones that the Francophones would just be outnumbered, right? That they wouldn't be able to exert as much power because instead of having an equal size Anglophone legislative assembly and Francophone legislative assembly, what you'd have is one Francophone legislative assembly. My goodness, I can't speak today. And then the Anglophone legislative assembly of Ontario and of Nova Scotia and of New Brunswick and of Prince Edward Island, and that way the Anglophone interests could sort of overwhelm the Francophone interests. So there's that kind of piece. There's some conversation about if you form all of those colonies into a single political entity, it's harder for the United States to sort of pick off one colony at a time and sort of eventually collect all of the land on the North American continent. So there's that kind of piece. And the other sort of big thing that's really, really important, again, especially if you are sort of in the political elite of what is now Ontario, is that creating a confederation like that offers you some opportunities to pursue forms of economic development by sort of that are really, really important. So we'll sort of talk about in our next video some conversations about East-West trade, right? It's important to understand that in the same way that we talked about free trade benefiting the most advanced economies, Ontario has the most advanced industrial economy in Canada in 1867. And so one of the advantages of Confederation for them is to provide guaranteed access to the emerging markets on the Canadian prairies, in sort of the Maritimes where there wasn't the same kind of industrial production, because that allows people to make a whole lot of money. And that's sort of an important piece about that. For the most part, it is pretty likely that there's very few people actually care about the idea of Confederation, other than the people who live in Canada West and Upper Canada, and especially their economic elite, because really, this doesn't change the day-to-day life for the vast number of Canadians at this point in time who are essentially subsistence farming and living on their homesteads. Like, it doesn't change anything for them. And for those of you who are looking for some new facts to sort of figure out, this is one of my favorite discussions to have. Go look up the experience of the Charlottetown Conference, and in particular, see if you can get a sense of how the delegates from Canada West convinced other people to join, because the answer is, in part, that they spent kind of a ridiculous amount of money on a particular substance to do so, and we can sort of talk about the context of how that would work out. Okay?